The laptop screen flickered to life in a stranger's kitchen, and I watched my husband's face fill the frame. I didn't know yet what I was about to see, only that Margaret Ellis's voice had gone quiet and careful on the phone that morning, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. I sat down slowly, my hands cold, despite the July heat pressing against the windows. Ethan's voice came through the speakers, first low and familiar, the same voice that had whispered good morning to me for 6 years. Then I heard my mother-in-law laugh, and the sound of it made my stomach turn. I had no idea sitting in that unfamiliar kitchen that I was about to watch my entire life get rewritten in front of me. I had been home for 11 days. 11 days since I stepped off that transport plane at Ramstein, and then again at Dulles since I felt Ethan's arms around me on the tarmac, tighter than I remembered, like he'd missed me more than words could carry. 9 months is a long deployment, long enough that you start rationing your memories of home, just to get through the nights long enough that coming back feels like stepping into a life you have to relearn the shape of. Ethan had handled everything while I was gone. Found the house in Fairfax County 20 minutes from the base, a brick colonial with a wide front porch and a maple tree that would turn gold in October. He'd sent me photos overseas, walked me through video calls at 3 a.m. his time so I could see the kitchen, the bedroom, the little office where he said I could keep my medals and my folded flags. I remember crying at my desk in the command post, grateful in a way that felt almost embarrassing that I had a husband who took care of things. Linda, his mother, had been just as attentive. She called me twice a month while I was overseas, sent care packages with beef jerky and paperback novels, told me she was praying for me every night. When I got home, she was at the house almost daily, helping me unpack boxes, hanging curtains, telling me how proud she was of her daughter-in-law, the officer. I thought I had married into a family that loved me the way I loved them. I thought the hardest part of my life was already behind me, buried somewhere in a desert I didn't talk about. I was wrong, and I didn't know it yet, not on that ordinary Tuesday morning when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is Margaret Ellis. I sold you the house on Birchwood Lane." I remembered her vaguely, an older woman, soft-spoken, who'd shaken my hand at closing and told me the house had good bones. She apologized for calling, said there was a small technical matter. Something about a security camera she'd forgotten to remove from the garage before the sale went through. It had been installed years ago after a break-in tucked behind a support beam, easy to forget, once the fear that put it there had faded. I told her it was fine, that she could send someone to retrieve it whenever it was convenient. Then her voice changed. It dropped into something careful, something bracing. "I've seen your husband," she said, "while you were away." I didn't understand at first. I actually laughed a little, said of course he lived there. But she didn't laugh back, and the silence on the line stretched long enough that I felt my pulse pick up in my throat. "Please don't tell him I called," she said. "If you want to know the whole truth, you need to come see me, alone." I sat in my car in the driveway for almost 10 minutes after that call, engine off, hands on the wheel, running through every reasonable explanation I could think of. Maybe Ethan had brought someone over to help with repairs. Maybe Margaret had misunderstood something she'd glimpsed through a window. I am not a woman who panics easily. 6 years in the Army teaches you to hold steady until you have facts. And I told myself that's exactly what I was doing, holding steady. But some part of me, some old instinct sharpened by too many briefings that started with bad news, already knew this wasn't nothing. I told Ethan I had errands to run. He kissed my forehead and told me to drive safe, and I hated just for a second how easy the lie came to me. Margaret lived 20 minutes away in a small rambler with a garden gnome by the mailbox and wind chimes on the porch. She let me in without much small talk, poured me coffee I didn't drink, and sat me down at her kitchen table in front of an old laptop. Her hands were shaking slightly as she opened the file. "I should have told you sooner," she said, "but I needed to be sure of what I was looking at first." She turned the screen toward me. "What you're about to see," she said quietly, "is going to change the way you look at your marriage." I reached for the laptop with a steadiness I didn't feel, and I pressed play. Margaret explained the camera's history before she let the footage run. Years ago, before she and her late husband installed a proper security system, someone had broken into the garage and made off with a table saw and a set of tools that had belonged to her father. The camera went up that same week, tucked into a shadowed corner behind a support beam, wired into an outlet that had nothing to do with the rest of the house's electrical panel. Over time, the fear faded, the way fear does, and the camera became something she simply stopped thinking about. When she sold the house, it never crossed her mind. She only remembered it 2 weeks ago doing a final walkthrough of old files on a backup drive, and once she started watching, she said she couldn't stop. The first clips were unremarkable. Ethan's car pulling into the driveway, Linda's sedan parked beside it. The garage door opening and closing at odd hours, sometimes 10 in the morning, sometimes closer to midnight. I watched myself lean forward without meaning to, studying my husband's posture, the way he moved through a garage that was technically still under our name, but not yet fully ours, not until the camera caught what came next. In the early videos, he and his mother looked like nothing more than a son, and his mother doing whatever it is families do when one of them is deployed and the house needs tending. Linda brought grocery bags. Ethan mowed a strip of lawn that didn't need mowing. It looked for a while like nothing, but Margaret kept fast-forwarding, and the pattern that emerged made my coffee go cold in my hands. They came more often than made sense for simple upkeep, and they didn't come empty-handed. I watched Ethan carry in a small portable scanner, the kind you'd use to digitize documents. I watched Linda arrive with a locked metal box I didn't recognize, the kind people use for important papers, deeds, passports, things you don't want lost in a fire. They spent hours in the garage. Some days the door cracked only a few inches, as if they didn't want the neighbors seeing too much light spilling out at strange hours. Then came the audio. Margaret had angled the camera years ago to catch the license plate of anyone who pulled in, and by some strange mercy of physics, it had also picked up voices near the workbench, tinny but clear enough. I heard Linda's voice first, casual, almost bored, like she was asking about the weather. "You're sure she never checks any of this?" And then Ethan, without hesitation, without even a beat of guilt in his tone. "Danielle trusts me, she always has." I didn't understand yet what this referred to. I sat very still, the way I'd been trained to sit still under fire, cataloging details instead of feeling them, because feeling them was going to cost me later, and I didn't have the luxury yet. Margaret must have seen something shift in my face, because she reached over and paused the video. "There's more," she said. "I wanted you to see this part slowly." The next clip was dated only 6 weeks earlier. Ethan stood at the workbench with a manila folder, and when he opened it, I recognized the paper inside. Even from the grainy angle, a stack of documents, each page bearing a signature that looked exactly like mine. My handwriting, my initials, the particular slant I've had since college. Except I hadn't signed anything in that garage. I hadn't been in that garage at all in the weeks those documents were dated. I was 11 time zones away, filling out equipment logs in a command tent, signing my name to entirely different paperwork under entirely different circumstances. I felt something cold settle low in my chest, the kind of cold that doesn't come from fear exactly, but from the first understanding that fear is about to be justified. I asked Margaret to replay it. I watched Ethan flip through the pages, slowly, almost admiring them, the way you'd admire a good forgery if you were the kind of person who forged things. I couldn't hear what the document said, the resolution wasn't good enough, and the angle cut off most of the text. But I didn't need to read them to understand this wasn't a mistake. Mistakes don't require a scanner and a locked box and a habit of choosing the hours when the neighborhood was asleep. Margaret closed the laptop partway, giving me a moment, though I didn't need one, not yet. My training has a strange mercy to it. Sometimes it lets you set the emotion aside in a drawer and deal with the facts. First, cry about it later if there's a later that allows for crying. I asked her when the most recent footage was from. She said, 3 days ago. 3 days ago, Ethan had made me dinner, told me about a work meeting that ran long, kissed the top of my head while I fell asleep on the couch during a movie. 3 days ago, he'd been standing in a garage with my signature on a stack of documents I'd never seen. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, and something in her voice made me brace before she even said it. She opened the last clip of the batch, the two of them still at the workbench, Linda leaning against the doorframe, now arms crossed, wearing the small, satisfied smile of someone very close to getting what she wants. "Just one more step," Linda said, looking at her son with something that might have passed in a stranger's eyes for pride, "and this house won't belong to her anymore." I didn't drive straight home. I sat in Margaret's driveway for a long while, watching the wind chimes move without hearing them running through the calculus of what to do next. The old instincts kicked in fast, the ones the army spends years drilling into. You don't react on incomplete intelligence. Don't tip your hand before you understand the full scope of the threat. Gather everything before you move. I called a friend from my JAG rotation, a former army lawyer named Renee Ashford, who now ran her own practice in Alexandria. I told her I needed to see her that afternoon, that it couldn't wait, and something in my voice must have carried the weight of it, because she cleared her schedule without asking why. Renee's office smelled like coffee and old paper, and she listened to the whole story without interrupting, once her pen moving steadily across a legal pad. When I finished, she asked for access to my email account, my bank statements, anything electronic tied to the house or our finances. I gave her everything. What we found over the next 2 hours rearranged the last several months of my life into a shape I hadn't let myself see. During my deployment, I had signed dozens of documents electronically, routine things, or what I'd believed were routine things. Refinancing paperwork on the house, arriving in my inbox with subject lines like, "Please sign when convenient," or "Quick signature needed for the mortgage company." Requests to update the property's title management framed as simple administrative housekeeping. A form adding a new beneficiary designation on an account I barely remembered opening, buried in a chain of forwarded messages that made it look routine, expected, harmless. Renee pulled up the metadata on each one, cross-referencing the timestamps against my deployment schedule. Every single document had landed in my inbox during a stretch of days when I was working 18-hour shifts, exhausted, half asleep, trusting that anything Ethan sent me was exactly what it claimed to be. That was the design of it. Not forgery in the crude sense he hadn't needed to fake my signature on most of these. Not when he could get the real one extracted from an exhausted woman half a world away who trusted her husband completely. He'd waited for the weeks I was least likely to read closely. He'd used language that sounded administrative boring, the kind of thing you sign without a second thought because you assume your spouse wouldn't send you anything that mattered without saying so out loud first. "This isn't carelessness," Renee said, sliding the legal pad toward me, the timeline laid out in her neat handwriting. "This took planning, months of it." I already knew that. I'd known it the moment I heard Linda's voice on that laptop asking if I ever checked. But hearing it confirmed by someone trained to look for exactly this kind of pattern made it undeniable in a different way, the way a diagnosis is different from a symptom. I drove home that evening with my face arranged into something normal. Ethan asked how my errands went, and I told him fine, told him I'd run into an old friend from the unit and lost track of time catching up. He believed me instantly, the same way I'd believed him for years, and there was something almost unbearable in how easy it was to deceive a person who has never once thought to doubt you. I made dinner. I let him tell me about his day, some minor complaint about a coworker. And I listened and nodded in the right places, and inside I felt like I was standing at the edge of a very tall building, calm on the outside, calculating the drop. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I thought about the woman I'd been 11 days ago, stepping off that plane, so grateful to be coming home to a family that loved her. I thought about every phone call from Linda overseas, every care package, every "I'm so proud of you," that I now had to hold up to the light and wonder what it had really been for. I didn't cry. I lay very still and listened to Ethan's breathing even out into sleep. And I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like clarity settling into place. I would not confront them yet. I would not give them the satisfaction of a scene or the warning to cover their tracks. I would watch, I would gather, I would let them believe exactly as they had planned that I suspected nothing at all. The next morning, I went about my routine coffee a run before the heat set in a video call with a supply sergeant about my return-to-duty timeline. Ethan left for work with a kiss and a joke about how quiet I'd been the night before. I told him I was just tired, still adjusting to time zones, and he accepted that the way he accepted everything I told him without a flicker of suspicion. My phone rang again that afternoon. Margaret's name on the screen made my stomach tighten before I even answered. The camera caught something else. She said, her voice tight with something between guilt and urgency. "Right before I finally shut the whole system down, I think you need to see it before you go any further. I went back to Margaret's house that same evening, telling Ethan I had a follow-up appointment with the VA about my post-deployment physical, another lie that slid out of me easier than I wanted to admit. Margaret met me at the door with the particular expression of someone who has been sitting with bad news all day and doesn't know how to hand it over gently. She led me back to the kitchen table, and this time she didn't ease into it. She just opened the laptop and pressed play. The angle was different this time, wider, catching part of the living room through the open garage-to-house door that must have been left ajar. Ethan and Linda sat close together on the sofa, the posture of two people who thought no one was watching, which of course they had every reason to believe since, as far as they knew, no one was. I braced myself for what I assumed I'd find. In every version of this story I'd built in my head over the last 2 days, there was another woman somewhere in the frame, some explanation that fit the shape of ordinary betrayal. I was almost relieving myself in advance, telling myself an affair would be simpler, cleaner, a wound I already understood the geography of. That is not what I saw. Ethan's voice, when it came, was thinner than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the confidence he wore like a second skin. He was talking about money. Investments that had gone bad, some venture in commercial real estate that had collapsed 18 months earlier, a string of bad decisions compounding on top of each other, until he was, by his own admission, staring down debt in the high 6 figures. I sat there listening to my husband describe a financial catastrophe I had never once heard about. Not in 6 years of marriage, not in a single phone call during my deployment, not in 11 days of homecoming dinners and quiet evenings on the couch. "I don't know what else to do," he said, and for one disorienting second I almost felt something like pity. Then Linda spoke, and whatever flicker of sympathy I'd had went cold and hard in my chest. "If we can just get the house," she said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing a grocery list, "this all gets solved." Ethan didn't argue. He didn't even pause. He agreed, and then the two of them began talking through the rest of it, with the ease of people who had clearly had this conversation more than once before. Finalize the transfer of the property quietly, restructure the accounts, and once everything was secured, Ethan would file for divorce. Clean, he said. Simple. Linda actually laughed at that word, a short, satisfied sound that I don't think I'll ever fully get out of my head. "She'll think it's just about money," Linda said. "She won't think it's about her." I watched my mother-in-law, a woman who had prayed for my safety over a static-filled phone line while I was 10,000 miles from home, plan the dismantling of my life with the same tone she used to discuss casserole recipes. I understood in that moment something that reordered everything I thought I knew about the last 6 years. Ethan had never loved that house because it was ours. He had never really loved the idea of us building something together. He had married a woman who was frequently gone for long stretches, who signed documents she trusted without reading twice, who came home grateful and unsuspecting every single time. I wasn't a wife to him in the way I'd believed. I was an asset with predictable blind spots. I didn't say anything for a long moment after the video ended. Margaret didn't push me to. She just sat there, letting the silence do whatever work silence does in moments like that. The next day I hired a private financial investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Grant Pelletier who'd spent 15 years doing forensic work for divorce attorneys before going independent. I gave him what I had: dates, document names the little Renee and I had already assembled, and asked him to find out exactly how deep Ethan's debt went and where the money trail led. It took him 4 days to come back with a report that confirmed everything and then some. Ethan wasn't just behind on a few payments. He had taken out a second mortgage on a property I didn't even know existed. A rental he and a college friend had bought 2 years ago now, underwater and hemorrhaging money every month. He'd also opened 2 lines of credit in the months before my deployment ended, both nearly maxed, both conveniently timed, to close right around when the house transfer was supposed to finalize. I read that report twice, sitting alone at my kitchen table in the house I was starting to think of less as a home and more as a battlefield I hadn't known I was standing in. There was no trembling this time, no cold shock working through my chest the way it had at Margaret's kitchen table. just a settling quiet, and absolute the particular calm I remembered from briefings before a difficult mission, when the fear burns off and all that's left is the plan. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the maple tree Ethan had shown me in photos overseas, the one he'd said would be beautiful in October. I won't stop them, I thought. I'm going to let them walk the rest of the way into this themselves. Once I made the decision not to confront them, everything after that became a matter of execution. And execution is something the Army trained into me long before Ethan ever put a ring on my finger. I stopped thinking of the next several weeks as a marriage falling apart, and started thinking of them as an operation with a clear objective: preserve, evidence, protect assets, and give them enough rope to finish tying the knot themselves. I have run logistics for convoys through hostile terrain. I have briefed commanders on contingencies nobody wanted to think about. This, I told myself, was not so different. It only required discipline, and discipline was the one thing nobody in that garage had accounted for. Renee walked me through the legal architecture of what needed to happen. Everything had to be documented before I moved, because gut instinct and moral certainty mean nothing in a courtroom without a paper trail behind them. I made copies of every video file Margaret had backed up in triplicate one set with Renee one, in a safe deposit box I opened under my name alone, one encrypted and stored with a friend outside the state, someone with no connection to Ethan or his family, just in case. I pulled 12 months of bank statements, credit reports, and mortgage documents